My parents chose my sister over me, then tried to sue me for it. That sentence alone feels like fiction, but I lived every word of it. My name is Olivia Wilde. I'm 37 years old, and I run a boutique design firm in Portland, Oregon. The irony is, I've spent most of my life creating beautiful things homes, interiors, brands, yet I never managed to design a family that actually felt like one. I didn't come from tragedy. I came from something much subtler, polite erasure. I was the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the girl who didn't need anything. My sister, Claire, 5 years younger, was the one who needed more attention, more help, more chances, and she always got them. We grew up in Bend, a picturesque town nestled in Central Oregon. My parents, Helen and Mark, ran a modest but successful flower shop on Main Street. They weren't cruel. They paid for school lunches. They attended PTA meetings. They asked about our homework, Claire's in detail, mine in passing. As a child, I couldn't articulate the feeling, but I always knew. When Claire had a sore throat, Mom stayed home from work. When I had bronchitis, I stayed in bed with a thermos of soup and a reminder to call if it got worse. I never rebelled. I overcompensated, straight A's, extracurriculars, early college classes. I took the silent route to prove my worth. I got accepted into UCLA's interior architecture program with a partial scholarship. My parents congratulated me with a short nod and a card that read, "We're proud of you, just don't forget where you come from." I paid my way with student loans, freelance work, and 3 years of ramen. Meanwhile, Claire, who had dropped out of community college twice by then, was living at home rent-free and helping manage the flower shop. It didn't bother me then, or at least I told myself it didn't. I had carved out my own world, far away, on my own terms. By 30, I'd built a client list that made design magazines take notice. I moved back to Oregon to be closer to family and launch my firm, Wild Studio. That was my first mistake. At the time, I still held this fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, proximity would bring connection, that if I proved I'd made something of myself, they'd finally see me not just as capable, but worthy for a while. Things were calm. My business grew, slowly but steadily. I bought a little craftsman house in southeast Portland, restored it with my own hands, and sent Mom photos of the tiles I picked out. She didn't respond. Claire, meanwhile, had moved in with her boyfriend, Jason, a part-time DJ and full-time spender. Within months, they were in financial trouble. I started getting calls. Could I consult on the shop's interior? Could I loan them $3,000 for new refrigeration? Could I look into helping Claire with her credit score? I said no to most of it. I offered advice instead of money. I thought I was drawing healthy boundaries. I thought that made me cold. Then, 2 years ago, my dad had a minor stroke. I drove down the next day, brought groceries, cleaned the house, made arrangements for in-home care. Claire posted a photo on Instagram with the caption, "Taking care of Dad, one day at a time." She showed up with a chai latte and left before the nurse even arrived. That post got hundreds of likes. My efforts got silence, but I didn't complain. I never did. That's how erasure works. It doesn't scream. It just slowly rearranges the furniture until you forget you were in the room. And then came the shock I never expected. It arrived on cream-colored stationery, with my mother's loopy signature at the bottom. A legal notification, thinly veiled as a birthday letter. In polite legalese, it informed me that my parents had updated their will. Everything, the house, the business, the assets would go to Claire because, quote, "She has more pressing needs, and you've already built a successful life on your own." No mention of gratitude. No acknowledgement of past support. just a line that sliced through years of silent tolerance. I sat on my kitchen floor and read the letter again and again. The wine I had poured to celebrate my studio's 5th anniversary stood untouched. In that moment, I wasn't the CEO of a respected design firm. I was a daughter discarded like old furniture, no longer needed, no longer seen. And the worst part, I wasn't even angry. I was exhausted, but I had no idea the real betrayal hadn't even started yet. The day after receiving that letter, I sat in my studio trying to sketch a layout for a new client, but my pencil barely moved. My hand was steady, but my mind kept circling back to that one line. You've already built a successful life on your own, as if that was a flaw, as if independence meant disqualification from being part of a family. I had always thought that success might earn their respect, if not their affection. Instead, it became their excuse to erase me. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call. I didn't yell or ask why. I did what I always did. I internalized it and went back to work. Only this time, something felt different. Something in me stopped hoping. A few weeks passed. Then Claire called. Her voice was sugary sweet, the kind she used when she needed something. Hey, Liv, I was thinking, you know how you're so good with branding and, customer stuff. Maybe you could help us rebrand the flower shop. We're thinking of turning it into more of a lifestyle space, workshops, candles, that kind of thing. I asked if she'd read the letter. She hesitated. Mom mentioned it, but come on, Olivia, you don't need any of that. You're doing fine. The ease with which she dismissed my pain made my stomach turn. I politely declined. Claire sighed and muttered, God, you've really changed. That phrase stuck with me. You've really changed. As if that were a bad thing. As if growing boundaries and saying no was a moral failing. I hung up and stared out the window of my office, watching the rain streak down like thin reminders of every time I had swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. The next week, I got an email from a mutual cousin. Congrats on the new magazine feature. It read, your mom posted it to her Facebook, said she's so proud of her daughter, the visionary. I blinked. The same woman who had legally cut me out of her life was now parading my success as a badge of maternal achievement. I felt sick. Not angry, not yet, just profoundly tired. But the switch flipped when the family reunion photos surfaced. Someone had tagged me by accident. There they were, Claire, my parents, extended cousins all smiling under the oak tree behind the flower shop. There was a table with a banner that read, The Wild Legacy. My name was nowhere, not even a mention. Claire was introduced in the caption as co-owner of the family business. I hadn't even been told the event was happening. It was as if I had died and they had rewritten history in my absence. That was the moment something in me broke clean in two. I was done asking for a seat at a table that was never set for me. I pulled away. I stopped replying to texts. When my mother called on Thanksgiving, I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that said, We missed you at dinner, but I hope you're well. Claire made your favorite squash soup. The casual cruelty of that sentence almost made me laugh. That December, I decided to take a solo trip to Santa Fe. I spent Christmas morning walking through the quiet desert landscape, surrounded by ochre hills and endless sky. For once, I didn't feel like a daughter lacking anything. I felt like a person reclaiming herself. When I got home, I found a thick envelope waiting in my mail. This time, it was from a law firm in Bend. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a formal notice. My parents and Claire were initiating legal proceedings to claim partial financial interest in my business. The claim that, during family discussions over the years, I had made verbal assurances to support the family financially once I made it. There were transcribed fragments of conversations I barely remembered lifted, twisted, turned into something legal-looking and cold. I stared at the paper for minutes before my eyes could even make sense of the words. They weren't just trying to take my story. They were trying to own it, legally, strategically, with full knowledge of how hard I had worked to build everything. And worst of all, they did it as if it were nothing more than a reasonable request. That night, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I did something colder. I called a lawyer, because if they wanted to reduce my life to paperwork, then I'd show them what I'd built on record, in full, and without their name on any of it. The attorney I hired, Daniel Whitaker, had the kind of calm that made people underestimate him, and that's exactly why I chose him. His office was tucked inside a nondescript brick building near downtown Portland. Nothing flashy, no unnecessary gloss. He listened to everything without interruption, just nodding slightly as I laid out the history, the letter, the new lawsuit. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "They're not suing for justice. They're suing because they think you won't fight back." That was the first time I felt the slow burn of anger replacing fatigue. Over the next week, I dug into every email, every message, every birthday card I'd kept. We printed every financial record since I graduated college, every loan I'd taken, every freelance payment, every dollar earned. There was no trace of support from them. They had offered no capital, no credit, not even a shared post the day I launched Wild Studio. The only thing they had offered was indifference until I became visible, until there was something to claim. Daniel advised we stay quiet until the first formal hearing. That meant pretending nothing was wrong, going to client meetings, hosting launch events, smiling through conversations about family values during design consultations. I started to notice things I hadn't before. Clients gushing about their parents investing in their business. Friends casually mentioning how their mom dropped off soup during flu season. I smiled politely, but inside I was shrinking. That quiet ache of what I never had became louder when I was forced to pretend it didn't matter. One night, I pulled out a box from storage things my grandmother had left me before she passed. She wasn't a warm woman, but she was practical, sharp, and deeply observant. She once told me, "People will only honor your boundaries if you build them out of stone, not suggestion." I found an old journal inside the box, a gift she had given me at 16. I had barely written in it back then. Now I opened to the first empty page and began to document everything. Not for them, for me, because if my life was going to be dissected in a courtroom, I wanted my version to be unshakable. The first court hearing was scheduled for late March. I remember the morning clearly because I dressed not like a designer, but like a defendant. Navy pantsuit, no jewelry, low bun. I wanted the judge to see me not as a successful entrepreneur, but as someone who had earned every inch of where she stood. My parents were there, sitting beside Claire, and her husband Jason, all dressed like they had just stepped out of a family portrait. My mother didn't look at me. My father gave me a short, measured nod. Claire gave me a small smile, the kind you give someone you're about to con. Their lawyer presented their claim with unsettling ease. He referenced conversations allegedly recorded by Claire, vague mentions of when I make it big. I'll help out. He cited a single dinner in 2015 when I had paid for everyone and made an offhand joke about covering the family tab forever. That line, that joke, was now in an official affidavit. I could feel my jaw tightening as I listened, not just because of the absurdity, but because I remembered that dinner. It was the only time I'd felt proud to give something to them, even if they hadn't said thank you. and now it was evidence. Daniel stood and responded with quiet precision. He presented bank statements, dated timelines, and copies of my original loan agreements. He outlined the origins of Wild Studio down to the dollar. He emphasized that no member of my family had contributed financially or professionally at any point. He asked the judge to consider the implications of turning casual family conversation into enforceable legal obligations. This isn't about promises, Daniel concluded. It's about projection, turning someone's success into a mirror for their own failures and trying to claim a reflection they never earned. We didn't win that day. It was just the beginning. But something shifted. The judge ordered a discovery phase, meaning both sides had to provide proof. Claire's confidence seemed to dim slightly when that word was said. Proof, because truth requires evidence, not entitlement. That night, I drove home in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just felt hollow. That kind of grief doesn't scream. It sits in the passenger seat beside you while you navigate a road you never chose. But in that quiet, I began to feel something else rise, not fury, not vengeance, but resolve. They had underestimated the one trait I inherited from them that actually mattered: persistence. If they wanted a battle, I'd give them one, but it would be on my terms, in my voice, and with my truth. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest I'd ever known from the outside. My life looked pristine. My firm had just signed 2 new contracts with hospitality brands expanding into the Pacific Northwest. My name was featured in a regional design magazine as one of the 10 women redefining West Coast aesthetics. Clients sent flowers, colleagues applauded, and yet, every time I walked through the door of my studio, I felt like an imposter in my own story, because behind the press and the progress, I was being dragged through the mud by the people who shared my last name. Discovery turned everything personal. Their lawyers subpoenaed my tax records, credit history, and emails. They demanded access to internal documents about the formation of Wild Studio, questioned whether any clients had familial ties, and even sent a request to interview my assistant under oath. It felt invasive, calculated not to win a case, but to wear me down, to make the process so emotionally and professionally expensive that I'd eventually give in. I won't lie. I considered it. More than once. Daniel never pressured me. He laid out the risks, the timeline, the costs. Then he said something I'll never forget. Sometimes the only way to end generational patterns is to be the one who doesn't fold, not for revenge. But so it ends with you. That sentence sat with me like a stone in my pocket. I carried it everywhere, even when I didn't want to. And then, a strange twist arrived. One of Claire's former high school friends, a woman named Becca who now worked at a nonprofit in Eugene, messaged me on Instagram. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Her note was short but specific. This might be overstepping, but I overheard Claire talking about the lawsuit. She said you wouldn't fight because you're too polished to get dirty. I just thought you should know. I stared at that message for minutes. Not because I was surprised she said it, but because she believed it that night. I took a drive, no destination, just movement, somewhere between the hills outside the city and the edge of the dark tree line. It hit me. I wasn't ashamed of being polished. I had worked for that polish. It was earned through years of rejection, self-discipline, quiet nights building pitch decks while other people slept. But maybe it was time to show them that polish wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I called Daniel the next morning. I want to countersue, I said plainly, not out of spite, but to force the truth into the open. There was a long pause on the line, then a quiet response. Okay, but we do this carefully. We hold the high ground. The countersuit wasn't for money. It was for defamation and undue interference with client contracts. We had documented proof that Claire had sent emails to 2 of my suppliers, subtly suggesting that I was under legal investigation for fraud. The emails were vague enough to avoid immediate alarm, but specific enough to plant doubt. One vendor had quietly pulled out of a renewal months earlier. I hadn't connected the dots until now. We also included a request for court-ordered mediation to uncover the extent of interference and false representation. It was a bold move, and Daniel warned me it might escalate tension. I didn't care anymore. I was done pretending this was just a misunderstanding. It was sabotage in slow motion, disguised as family tension. The legal team on their side panicked. Within a week, they filed to delay the proceedings. It was a signal one I recognized instantly. Their narrative was cracking. When you build a claim on manipulation and entitlement, truth becomes your greatest threat. I spent the next few days revisiting old client files, not for legal strategy, but for memory. I wanted to remind myself what I had built, projects that had transformed entire restaurant chains, boutique hotels that now bore my signature wall patterns, a community arts center that used my layout to host trauma recovery workshops. None of this came from family funds. It came from sleepless nights, taking risks when no one believed, and holding my breath through every decision. I wasn't perfect, but I had earned this. Then came the moment that flipped everything. One of the accountants involved in the discovery phase uncovered a series of old bank transactions transfers from my parents' business account to Claire's personal account, labeled investment reimbursement during the exact time they were claiming financial hardship in their lawsuit. Claire had received more than $42,000 over 2 years. That detail wasn't just a contradiction, it was exposure. It turned their entire claim on its head. They had framed me as the greedy daughter withholding support, but in reality, they had been quietly funneling funds to the needy sister all along. Daniel prepared the documents to submit this as supplemental evidence, but he asked me again, just before filing, "Are you sure you want to keep going?" I nodded. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about telling the truth while I still have the strength to stand in it. The day the evidence was submitted, everything shifted for months. I had been the one under scrutiny, answering vague accusations twisted into legal language. But now, with one file, the balance tilted. The transactions from my parents to Claire weren't just numbers. They were a quiet confession that undermined their entire claim. Suddenly, I wasn't just defending myself. I was exposing something they never thought would see daylight. Their legal team tried to explain the transfers away as family reimbursement, but they had no documentation to back it. No contracts, no receipts, not even an email. It was the kind of move people make when they're sure no one will ever question them. That had always been their power, the illusion of untouchability. They counted on silence. They counted on me staying the quiet, obedient daughter. They never expected I'd become the woman willing to burn down the illusion to protect what I built. I didn't say anything to them directly. I let the facts speak, but I heard through mutual connections that the pressure was getting to them. Claire was calling around, trying to get character references. My father had reportedly stopped showing up at the shop. My mother was seen asking for a meeting with a church elder who also happened to be a retired mediator. They were scrambling, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. I felt seen. But this wasn't just about winning, not for me. There was something deeper that had started to unfold, something I hadn't expected. I began receiving quiet messages from people I barely knew. A distant cousin wrote, "I always admired you, but never felt it was okay to say it." A former classmate messaged, "Your story is giving me courage to finally say no to my family's control. I wasn't trying to become an example. I was just surviving, but it made me realize something. Sometimes the act of standing up for yourself doesn't just liberate you, it gives other people permission to question the roles they were assigned to." One night, about a week before the final hearing, I received an email from Claire. No greeting. Just, "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family." I stared at the screen for a long time before closing my laptop. There was a time when that sentence would have gutted me, when I would have responded with explanations, apologies, maybe even an offer to de-escalate. But now I saw it for what it was. Projection. She wasn't grieving the family. She was grieving the control they had lost over the version of me they'd invented. Daniel called the next day. "They want to settle," he said. "They're offering to drop all claims if you agree to remove your countersuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement." I asked him what he thought. He was quiet for a moment. "This is your choice, but if we accept, they walk away without consequences. They rewrite this as a misunderstanding. They'll never admit what they did." I let that sink in. I had never wanted revenge, but I did want accountability, and for once, I had leverage. I told him no. We'd proceed. The day of the final hearing felt surreal. The courtroom was quiet, almost too quiet. I took a seat next to Daniel, watching my parents and Claire across the aisle. They looked smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically. The confidence they carried months ago had been replaced with a kind of fragile discomfort. I didn't relish it, but I didn't pity it either. The judge entered, a stern woman in her 60s who had followed the case closely since the beginning. She asked for final statements. Claire's lawyer stood and tried to paint a picture of confusion, family miscommunication, and unfortunate emotional escalation. He avoided direct lies, but leaned hard into emotional manipulation. All they wanted was a sense of fairness, a gesture. Then Daniel stood. His voice was clear, precise. He reminded the court of the timeline, the lack of evidence from their side, the verified interference with business partners, and the documented history of entitlement. This was not a misunderstanding. He said it was an attempt to legally extract from a woman what they had already failed to nurture emotionally. The judge asked a few final questions, then recessed. 20 minutes later, she returned with a ruling. The original suit against me was dismissed entirely, with prejudice. The countersuit would not proceed further due to lack of demonstrable damages. But the court acknowledged the attempted interference. She closed her folder, looked directly at my parents, and said something I'll never forget. "This courtroom cannot repair the wounds between you, but it can name what happened here for what it was, opportunism dressed as family obligation." As the gavel fell, a strange silence followed, not relief, not celebration, just stillness, like something long trapped had finally been named and let go. I stood, gathered my papers, and walked past them without a word. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was unsettled, but because something in me had finally gone quiet, not numb, not indifferent, but still. The kind of stillness that only comes after you've walked through fire and made it out with your name, your truth, and your dignity intact. I sat at my kitchen counter, sipping lukewarm tea, staring at the antique lamp my grandmother once gave me. She used to say, "Don't chase people who have already decided they can live without you." For years, I misunderstood that. I thought it meant giving up. Now I realized it meant freeing yourself. The messages started pouring in the next morning. Some came from people I hadn't heard from in years, high school classmates, old co-workers, acquaintances who had watched the trial unfold through court notices or whispers in small-town corners. I can't believe what you went through. You're stronger than I ever knew. That must have been brutal. The truth it was. But it was also necessary. Because some betrayals don't get smaller with time. They grow until you either bury yourself under them or finally put them on the table and name them for what they are. I went back to work the following Monday. My team had kept things running with quiet loyalty. No one asked for details. No one pried. They just picked up where we left off. That's what real support looks like. Not dramatics, not pity, but presence. And in that steady rhythm of returning to the work I loved. I found a kind of grounding I hadn't felt in months. 2 weeks later. I received a thin envelope with no return address. Inside were a few photos, old family pictures I hadn't seen in years. A childhood birthday party. Me holding a ribbon at a spelling bee. My hand on the shop's register the summer I helped out during high school. There was no note, but the handwriting on the front matched my mother's. It didn't feel like reconciliation. It felt like return, like she was handing me back the past she no longer wanted to be responsible for. I didn't cry. I didn't call her. I placed the photos in a drawer and moved on. Not out of bitterness, but because healing doesn't always look like closure. Sometimes it just looks like not needing an answer anymore. Claire didn't reach out, but word got around that her marriage was falling apart. Jason had left after the lawsuit ended, and she'd been struggling to cover the business debts they'd tried to pin on me. Again, I felt no pleasure in her pain, just a quiet observation. The same energy you try to steal will eventually turn against you. It always does. In that strange calm between endings and new beginnings, I started thinking about legacy, not the kind you leave in a will, but the kind you build in the way you treat people. I didn't want my story to end in courtrooms and conflict. I wanted it to mean something more. So I began drafting a new project, a creative mentorship program for young women launching their first design businesses. Not a nonprofit, not a charity, a partnership rooted in structure, boundaries, and belief, the three things I had longed for most growing up. By the end of that spring, I had 5 mentees, all of them different, all of them brilliant. One of them, Layla, a 24-year-old from a rural town, reminded me so much of myself at that age, it hurt. Focused, cautious, starving for permission to dream bigger. The day she launched her first solo project, she sent me a message that simply read, "You're the first person who ever told me I could do this without apologizing for who I am." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I whispered, not to her, but to the younger version of myself I had carried all these years, that message was for you too. Sometimes people think justice only comes with punishment, but in my case, justice looked like peace. It looked like walking through my front door and not scanning my phone for threats. It looked like knowing that I didn't have to prove anything to people who had already made up their minds. Most of all, it looked like standing in a room filled with people who knew me, really knew me, and feeling no need to defend who I had become. Because when you build your life from the ground up, no one can ever truly take it away, not even the people who gave you your name. It took nearly 6 months for life to feel steady again, not because things had calmed down outside, but because I had finally found stillness inside. The lawsuit, the family silence, the cold letters and courtroom stares, they no longer followed me into my mornings. I woke up without checking my inbox in fear. I sat in meetings and felt present again. I looked around at the space I had built, the studio, the home, the people, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for it all to be taken away. One quiet Sunday afternoon, I was tending the small herb garden behind my house when I heard a knock at the side gate. It wasn't loud, more like someone hesitant. I walked over, expecting a neighbor, maybe a delivery. But it was Claire. She looked different, not broken, just real. No polished hair, no passive-aggressive smile, just jeans, a jacket, and tired eyes. For a second, we just stood there. I didn't say anything, neither did she. Then finally, she asked, "Can we talk?" I let her in. Not because I was ready, but because I wasn't angry anymore. She sat at the patio table, glancing around the yard like it was some foreign country she wasn't sure she belonged in. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said. I need to tell the truth. At least once. I didn't nod. I didn't reassure. I waited. She took a breath and said, "They lied to me too. Olivia, about a lot of things. They told me you'd made promises. They said you owed us, that you abandoned the family to be some cold designer in a city that didn't care about people like us. I wanted to believe them, because if I didn't, I'd have to admit I was used to feeling chosen, even when it was unfair. That hit harder than I expected. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was just naming what had never been said aloud, that favoritism had fed her as much as it had starved me. You were always stronger," she added, "and I hated you for that. But I also depended on it, because if you ever failed, I'd have no excuse left for my own mess." There was no drama in her voice, no begging, just truth, stripped of performance. I nodded slowly. "It's not about blame anymore," I said. "It's about what we do now. We didn't solve everything that day. That's not how real stories work. There was no tearful hug, no music rising in the background, but there was a beginning, a fragile one, built on honesty instead of obligation." She asked if I'd be willing to have coffee sometime just to talk, not as sisters trying to rewrite the past, but as women trying to learn how to exist without hurting each other. Later that night, I journaled something simple. Healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet door being left unlocked, and that's what I did. I left the door unlocked, not open, not wide, but no longer shut with dead bolts. Around that same time, I got an invitation to speak at a conference for independent women entrepreneurs. I hesitated at first. I wasn't interested in standing on a stage and telling a sanitized story about rising from adversity, but the organizer told me, "We don't want your polished version. We want your honest one." That changed everything. I agreed. The day of the talk, I stood backstage in front of a plain mirror. No makeup artist, no assistant, just me, the outline of a story that had once broken me, now folded neatly into memory. When I stepped out and looked into the audience, I saw faces that reminded me of myself, tired, driven, quietly hoping they weren't alone. I began not with credentials, not with the lawsuit, but with a sentence that was once too painful to say aloud. My parents chose my sister over me, then tried to sue me for it, and I'm still here. The room was silent, not with discomfort, but with permission, because in that moment, I wasn't just telling my story, I was holding a space for others to breathe in their own. That night, a woman in her 50s approached me. "Thank you," she said quietly. I thought I was the only one who'd been erased by her own family. I squeezed her hand. "You're not. Because the truth is, family isn't always built on blood. It's built on behavior, on mutual respect, on the willingness to see someone fully and love them anyway. And maybe, just maybe, it starts with seeing yourself first, in the weeks after that conference. I started receiving letters, not emails, not social messages, real, handwritten letters from women in their 20s, 40s, 60s. Some signed with names, some anonymous. All of them said the same thing in different ways. Thank you for saying what I've never been able to admit out loud. One letter in particular stuck with me. It came from a woman in Michigan who wrote, I spent 30 years trying to earn my mother's love, only to realize she only loved me when I needed her. Your story made me realize that letting go isn't betrayal, it's self-respect. I folded that letter carefully and placed it in the back of my journal. There's something about hearing the truth from strangers that heals what your own family refused to see, and it reminded me that the life I was building, the home, the work, the community wasn't just survival, it was a blueprint, something I could pass forward, not by force, but by choice. One afternoon, I received a text from Claire, not long, just a sentence, I'm in Portland this weekend if you're free. I stared at it for a while, not out of suspicion, but consideration. I didn't feel dread. I didn't feel hope. I just felt open. And that was enough. We met at a small cafe not far from my studio. She looked calmer. Her eyes were still tired, but no longer defensive. She had brought a manila envelope and placed it on the table. I went through Dad's things, she said. Found some things I thought you should have. Inside were drawings I'd done as a child, old report cards, a newspaper clipping from my first college award that I didn't even know they'd saved. Beneath all that was a letter, handwritten, from our father, dated 3 months before the lawsuit. It wasn't long, but the words were clear. Olivia was never the problem. She was the proof that we didn't give equally. I don't know how to fix that, but I know she didn't deserve what's coming. I read it in silence. Then I looked up and saw tears in Claire's eyes. I wish he had said it out loud. She whispered. I nodded. So do I. We didn't say much after that, but before she left, she said something I hadn't expected. I'm not asking you to let me back in. I just want to stop being the person who benefited from hurting you. That moment, right there, meant more than any apology. Because it wasn't about mending the past. It was about breaking the cycle. She didn't try to rewrite history. She just took ownership of her part in it. And for me, that was enough. That spring, I launched Studio North, an extension of Wild Studio, dedicated to mentoring first-generation creatives and businesswomen who were building without a safety net. We didn't offer grants or shortcuts. We offered infrastructure, strategy, boundaries, things I wish someone had given me when I was 25 and too proud to admit how lost I felt. In our first cohort, we worked with a ceramic artist from New Mexico, a fashion consultant from Detroit, and a brand strategist from Spokane. Each woman brought her own version of strength, some loud, some quiet, but all of them carried a version of the same wound, the belief that independence meant being alone. I made it clear from the beginning, we're here to help you build something sustainable, not save you. No one is coming to rescue you, but that doesn't mean you have to walk through the fire alone. It was the exact opposite of what I grew up hearing. Sometimes I'd come home from the workshops and just sit in silence, not because I was drained, but because I was full of something I never thought I'd know: peace, the kind that comes from living without performance, from not editing yourself in the presence of others, from no longer twisting your success into a shape that makes other people comfortable. One night, as I watered the basil plants on my windowsill, I thought about that first letter from my mother, the one that had started everything. The paper was still in a drawer somewhere. I hadn't read it in over a year. I didn't need to, because now I had something stronger than answers. I had clarity. I had people around me who didn't see me as a provider, or a problem, or a threat. Just me, and that, after everything felt like the rarest kind of love. By summer, Studio North had taken on a rhythm of its own, twice a month. We held strategy circles, not therapy sessions, but honest, focused gatherings where women could sit across from each other and name what they'd spent years suppressing, one by one. Stories poured out. A woman whose father called her business cute until she out-earned him. A designer whose mother refused to attend her launch party because she didn't understand any of that tech stuff. A founder whose sister sabotaged a pitch deck and then blamed it on poor communication. Every story had its own details, but the emotional core was painfully familiar invisibility within your own bloodline. I didn't share mine in full, not yet, but I didn't hide it either. I let the room know I understood the weight of success that came without applause. The ache of realizing your biggest supporters were people you hadn't met until after you'd already bled for your vision. And slowly, something beautiful began to happen. The women stopped apologizing for wanting more. They stopped asking if it was okay to take up space. They started taking it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. And to me, that felt like the beginning of real change. One afternoon after a session, I lingered alone in the studio. The late light pooled across the wood floors, and for a moment, everything was quiet, that kind of quiet that feels earned. I looked around at the shelves lined with ceramic samples, mood boards, sketches in progress, not symbols of ambition, but of process, of persistence, of proof. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was reclamation of time, voice, vision, everything I once believed had been taken from me. The door opened gently, and Alyssa walked in. She had been my assistant once, but now ran her own boutique agency across town. We still met for coffee every Sunday, but lately, our conversations had deepened, less about deadlines, more about identity. "I brought something," she said, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a framed photo of me standing in front of the first Wild Studio opening day, back when everything felt uncertain. "You should hang this," she said, "not because you need to remember what you survived, but because you should see who you've become." I didn't respond right away, just held it, quietly, and in that silence, something clicked. I had stopped waiting for acknowledgement from the people who had withheld it the longest, and I hadn't even noticed, because I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I was creating continuation. That weekend, Claire emailed again, this time with an update. She was moving, starting a part-time counseling certification focused on family dynamics. "I think I need to understand what we grew up inside," she wrote. Not to blame, just to stop repeating it. I reread that line a few times. Not to blame, just to stop repeating it. It hit me harder than anything else she had ever said, because that, I realized, was exactly what I'd spent the last 2 years doing. Not blaming, just refusing to pass it on. There's a kind of quiet revolution in that, the kind no one claps for, but it matters. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine and watched the city wind down. Lights in windows flicking off one by one, somewhere in the distance. A child laughing, somewhere else, someone cleaning up from a long shift. The world kept turning, and for once, I wasn't chasing it. I was just here, present, whole, not because everything had healed, but because I had chosen not to be defined by the parts that didn't. I thought about the final words in that letter my father never sent, the ones Claire had handed me weeks earlier. If she reads this someday, I hope she knows I see her now, and in some quiet way. I did believe he meant it, maybe not in time, but sometimes. Acknowledgement doesn't need to arrive early. It just needs to be honest. That simple truth, I see you now, was something I carried not just for me, but for every woman I worked with, mentored, collaborated with, or simply listened to. Because when you've lived through being overlooked by the very people who should have lifted you up, there's nothing more powerful than looking someone else in the eye and saying, I see you. You're not invisible here. That's what I built. Not just a business, not just a boundary, but a place where people were finally allowed to be visible without shrinking, without apology. I used to think closure would come like a door slamming shut loud, final, undeniable. But the truth is, it arrived like a soft pause. One day I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my phone for a message that was never coming. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head. I wasn't scanning the past for missed signals or lost moments. I had simply stopped needing a version of love that only showed up when it was convenient. That, I suppose, was freedom these days. I take morning walks before the city wakes. There's something grounding about quiet streets and early light, no performance, no obligation, just air, motion, and the steady sound of my own footsteps. When I pass the studio windows, I often see the lights already on. My team, the women I've grown with, are inside not because they owe me anything, but because we've built something they believe in. That belief is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Claire texts sometimes, not too often, just enough to remind me we're not rewriting the past, but we are reshaping the present. She's in training to become a counselor now, focused on family systems and emotional neglect. When she told me that, I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt quiet, because for the first time, she was doing something for herself, not to impress, not to compete, not to catch up, just to understand. As for my mother, she never followed up. No letters, no second thoughts, no late night calls, and somehow that no longer hurts. Her silence isn't an open wound, it's just space. I've stopped mistaking silence for punishment. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's a boundary you don't have to fight for. And sometimes it's just the natural distance that forms when you stop pretending things were ever okay. One of the most surprising things about healing is how uneventful it feels when it's real. It doesn't show up like fireworks. It shows up in small, steady moments. When you finish a hard week and no longer crave validation. When you look at your own reflection and don't flinch. When your success feels like peace, not a point to prove. A few months ago, I spoke at a panel titled, What We Build After We're Burned. It wasn't about business. It was about rebuilding identity after betrayal, especially by family. I stood in front of 100 women and told them the part of my story I used to avoid. How my parents disinherited me. How my sister once believed I owed her a share of my success. How I survived a courtroom where the people who raised me tried to take apart everything I had built. There was no bitterness in my voice, just facts, and the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to prove. After the talk, a woman in her 50s approached me. She didn't say much, just, thank you. I thought I was the only one. I knew exactly what she meant, because the loneliest part of being erased is wondering if anyone else has ever been quietly deleted by the people who were supposed to protect them. That's what makes this kind of betrayal so dangerous. It rarely looks violent. It looks like politeness. Like being called strong when what you really needed was softness. Like being thanked for your independence because your dependence made them uncomfortable. That night, I went home and opened a drawer in my desk where I keep a few things. I don't show anyone letters, photographs, the original lawsuit documents, and the note my father never sent but left behind. I read it again. The last line still hits me. She didn't deserve what's coming. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And in a strange way, it helped me let go of the version of him I had tried to keep alive. Because the truth is, if you want to heal, you can't build your future on the hope that someone else will one day explain your pain for you. You do it yourself, quietly, relentlessly, day by day. The studio now mentors nearly 24 women across the country. Some are designers, some founders, some just figuring out where to begin. They don't ask for shortcuts. They ask for structure, for community, for honesty. And that's what we give. Not rescue, not fantasy, just real work, built on real experiences, the kind you don't post about, but carry in your spine. And me, I've stopped looking for a seat at someone else's table. I built my own, and I invite people who don't need to be impressed, only respected. So if you've ever been left out of the photo, removed from the list, or made to feel like your strength was the reason you didn't deserve support, hear this? Being overlooked doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you were growing somewhere they weren't willing to look. And now that you know, the only question left is, what will you build that no one else can take credit for?